Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. We are not in the studio today. I'm on the road. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm here for a Schmodown event that happened yesterday, and we're staying here a couple of days. Mara and I are enjoying our second home now for a little while. So we are bringing you a road version of the show, but there is so much to talk about. Some stuff that we knew we were going to be talking about, like Jungle Cruise and The Rock and Emily Blunt, and also the big news that broke last week, which is Scarlett Johansson's lawsuit against Disney for the streaming hybrid release of Black Widow. I have not only the details of that complaint that was filed against Disney, but I had an actual lawyer reach out to me and give me his opinion on the case and the merits of the case and what we might see. So we're going to break all of that down. There's so much to get to today, so let's jump right into it and look at the top 5 for this past week. And the number 1 movie is another Disney movie, Jungle Cruise, debuting to $35 million. This was a little bit higher than had been expected by a lot of analysts, but this is also interesting to talk about when we are analyzing the COVID curve, if you will, because this is another $200 million movie plus marketing. And any other time, this would be an absolute box office disaster. But there are 2 reasons mitigating it. Number 1, the COVID curve, or whatever you want to call it. Number 2, the fact that this is another hybrid streaming release. This was put out on Disney Premier Plus or Disney Access, whatever the hell they call it. Disney Plus with Premier Access, I guess, is what the technical name for it is. They reported another $30 million or so in streaming revenue this past weekend. And this is just an interesting thing to break down because, we'll never know how this would do in a regular box office scenario. We'll never know how it would do non-streaming. We only know what the box office numbers are. And even by that metric, it was a pretty good number by The Rock standards if you take the Fast and the Furious franchise out, when you just talk about how he does as an action star. It topped movies like Skyscraper. But everyone's talking about The Rock. I want to take a second and talk about Emily Blunt because this is also a good opening for Emily Blunt. When we look at Emily Blunt's debut numbers domestically, Jungle Cruise was actually her 3rd highest domestic opening of all time, setting a mark behind A Quiet Place, and then behind the mark that she set earlier this summer with A Quiet Place Part 2 at $47 million. Then you see Jungle Cruise there above 35, The Wolfman at number 4, and Edge of Tomorrow at number 5. So this has been a banner summer for Emily Blunt, 2 of her 5 highest opening movies of all time. And actually, when you look at the domestic numbers as far as the summer goes so far, Emily Blunt is summer of 2021's highest earning box office star so far. When you look at this, and this is in ascending order, Samuel L. Jackson, because he's been in a couple movies, The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard and Spiral from the Book of Saw. Then you have, in a tie, the cast of The Conjuring 3, the cast of Cruella, the remaining cast of A Quiet Place Part 2, the cast of Black Widow, the cast of F9. Michelle Rodriguez, because she was in a smaller movie that we've seen on the limited release charts called I Carry You With Me, she actually stands just a hair above the rest of the cast of F9. And so behind Emily Blunt is now the 2nd highest grossing star of summer 2021. And then you have Emily Blunt, based on the opening weekend of Jungle Cruise as well as the theatrical run of A Quiet Place Part 2, is number 1. However, we have big weeks coming up for Ryan Reynolds. He's already been in The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard. He's got Free Guy coming up. And then John Cena, who's in F9, but will also be in The Suicide Squad. Margot Robbie, who's in The Suicide Squad, but also appeared in Peter Rabbit 2, The Runaway. Look for those names to move up the list. I'm going to keep this list going throughout the summer because I think this is pretty interesting. But thus far, Emily Blunt is the top box office draw of summer 2021. I don't know if a lot of people would have had that down at the beginning of the year as the number 1 star of the summer up to this point. So even though Jungle Cruise itself, there's a lot to be written and a lot has been written. Again, this is not a movie that in any other scenario but this one, a $35 million opening would be considered a success. However, we are in strange times. I still think it's going to be a very tricky road to profitability because we have to see how does the movie do on the marketplace, how will it continue to do on Disney Plus with Premier Access, because we don't know those numbers. If tradition holds, they're not going to release any further numbers on how it did. That $30 million number is nice. It's a nice little thing to add to the box office, but we don't know how it's going to do beyond then. And then internationally, much like Space Jam: A New Legacy, much like Black Widow, Jungle Cruise is also still in line as I'm recording the show for a Chinese release date. The Rock is a big draw in China. Is this movie going to have a Chinese release? How much is that going to generate? There's a lot to be written and a lot to be told. But In normal times, this would not be a successful launch. We just have to see how we go from here. Looking at the rest of the top 5, Old and The Green Knight, these two movies actually switched. Yesterday's estimates had The Green Knight as the second highest grossing film of the weekend, with Old just a little bit behind. When the final numbers came in, Old was actually the highest grossing film of the weekend, with The Green Knight at number 3. Black Widow is at number 4, and then Matt Damon's Stillwater is performing in 5th place at number 5. But Black Widow, obviously the one getting a lot of the ink and the one that we're going to talk about for quite a bit here, because this was really unexpected news. Scarlett Johansson filing a lawsuit against Disney, and only Disney. We'll talk about that when we get into the legal part, breaking this down, because they released Black Widow as a hybrid release on streaming and in theaters at the same time. Johansson is alleging that this deal cut into her profit participation for the movie and devalued her as a star. So let's start, first of all, just by looking at a little bit. This is just a small portion of the complaint that was filed by Scarlett Johansson's legal team. They said, quote, Disney wanted to lure the picture's audience away from movie theaters and toward its own streaming service where it could keep the revenues for itself while simultaneously growing the Disney Plus subscriber base, a proven way to boost Disney's stock price. Second, Disney wanted to substantially devalue Ms. Johansson's agreement and thereby enrich itself. In the months leading up to this lawsuit, Ms. Johansson gave Disney and Marvel every opportunity to right their wrong and make good on Marvel's promise, that promise being that it would have a wide theatrical release. Unlike numerous other movie studios, however, including Warner Brothers, who, on information and belief, settled with its talent on films such as Wonder Woman after it released those films day and date to its streaming service, HBO Max, last year, Disney and Marvel largely ignored Ms. Johansson, essentially forcing her to file this action. And I think it's interesting that they bring HBO Max into this, because we've been talking about this since late last year, I think, when HBO Max decided that this was going to be their strategy. And we had all of these different stories coming out that they had to talk to Gal Gadot, they had to talk to Patty Jenkins, you had stars like Denzel Washington. I think that talks perhaps are still ongoing with Denis Villeneuve, not just about the strategy, but about compensation. And there was a widely reported news item that there had been a settlement reached with Gal Gadot and Patty Jenkins, specifically on Wonder Woman 1984, because there would be a box office impact to the streaming release. So the fact that, according to Scarlett Johansson's legal team, Disney and Marvel did not remedy this is surprising to me, because we've already encountered these problems before. Obviously, there was a belief on the part of Disney that they didn't need to settle anything, and this is where the root of this lawsuit lies. Scarlett Johansson and her legal team believe that Disney is keeping the money for themselves, that they were essentially used the Disney Plus streaming model to cut her out of profit participation and hurt the movie at the box office. The lawsuit alleges that a substantial amount of her compensation for the film was tied to box office revenue specifically. Disney is saying that's not the case. They actually came out and hit very hard against Scarlett Johansson. This was Disney's response to the lawsuit. They said there is no merit whatsoever to this filing. The lawsuit is especially sad and distressing in its callous disregard for the horrific and prolonged global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Disney has fully complied with Ms. Johansson's contract, and furthermore, the release of Black Widow on Disney Plus with Premier Access has significantly enhanced her ability to earn additional compensation on top of the $20 million she has received to date. So there's some major shade being thrown there. First of all, by dropping what her compensation is, because if you ask me, that's essentially Disney trying to paint her as greedy, essentially saying like, well, she's already gotten $20 million, and then throwing the thing of just like throwing COVID, at her. And again, I think that this just goes to show you, and this shouldn't be surprising, or maybe it is a little surprising, that they're playing hardball in this manner. This wasn't one of those, oh, this is an unfortunate circumstance, we value Ms. Johansson as a contributor, and, we hope that, while we believe that we blah, blah, blah. Then the playing nice version, this is them basically saying Scarlett Johansson's greedy, she's ignorant to the pandemic, this is really painting her in a bad light, or at least Disney's spin on it. So you can tell that this is not a lawsuit that they are very happy about. I was just going to kind of speak about my thoughts on this lawsuit, because honestly, I think that this is another symptom of where we are, of the different economy that we're in, not just as consumers at the box office, but as box office stars. We've talked about this for such a long time, and this was bound to happen at some point. And there's been rumors and speculation, and who knows, that maybe Emma Stone could be jumping on this, maybe Emily Blunt could be jumping on this, because Cruella and Jungle Cruise also had the same Disney Premier Access access deal. We'll see if that is something that actually does materialize. But this was going to happen because when you change the distribution model like this, a traditional cast contract that is drawn up is very heavily tied to box office receipts, box office revenue. And when you kind of go around that, after a contract has been drawn up, as was the case with Scarlett Johansson with Black Widow, you're going to have these kinds of conflicts if they're not resolved before they hit the legal system. I actually had a lawyer reach out to me. He is part of my Patreon, and he emailed me and said, hey, listen, I'm a lawyer. I think this is a very fascinating case, and, would you like to know my thoughts? So this is kind of a legal perspective on this case. This is from Daniel Strunk, and thank you, Daniel, for allowing me to use our correspondence here and your thoughts on this case. But these are his thoughts on the matter, and these are very extensive. I think these are a really fascinating perspective because, I am not a lawyer. I can only give my personal thoughts. This is what Daniel had to say to me. He starts by saying, in short, only one thing matters, and that one thing is the following language in Scarlett Johansson's contract with Marvel. And Daniel actually, as a lawyer, read the complaint, read what was filed with the court, and read this is the actual contract language that was in Scarlett Johansson's contract with Disney and Marvel. Quote, lender, Johansson's company, shall furnish producer, Marvel, the services of artist, Johansson, to perform the role of Black Widow in the theatrical motion picture currently entitled Black Widow, for the avoidance of doubt if producer, Marvel, in its sole discretion determines to release the picture, then such release shall be a wide theatrical release of the picture, i.e. no less than 1,500 screens. So this is the contract language that Scarlett Johansson's legal team is using, and that Disney probably is also going to use, as we'll see here in a second, saying that she was guaranteed as an actor that the film would receive a wide release of no less than 1,500 screens. So this is what Daniel goes on to say. He says, the key question is the following. Does the language wide theatrical release mean that the release has to be exclusive to theaters? Johansson argues the following. Wide theatrical release means that the release must be exclusively theatrical. A wide theatrical release cannot be a release to both theaters and streaming. Disney will argue the following. Wide theatrical release means that if we release the movie, we have to do so on at least 1,500 screens. Wide theatrical release does not mean that the release must be exclusive to theaters. So the question at the heart of it here is not whether the movie got a wide release. It did. It was released to 1,500 theaters or more. The question is going to be, does the contract language specify, is it required in the contract that the movie is exclusively released to theaters? So this is what Daniel goes on to say. Note that the parties are going to emphasize different language. Disney will say that what Johansson bargained for was that the release be wide, i.e. at least 1,500 screens. Johansson, in contrast, will say that what she bargained for was that the release be theatrical, i.e. not on streaming. If agents weren't already making sure that contracts spelled out streaming details, Johansson's lawsuit will make sure that they do so now. So this is going to definitely set some precedent. This is Daniel's take on the lawsuit. He says, my take is that Johansson has a good argument. This is not a frivolous lawsuit. My current take, subject to change as I learn more, is that she has the better argument. The contract says that such release shall be a wide theatrical release. Importantly, such release is singular. There is only one release, i.e. it doesn't say such releases. And that one release must be a wide theatrical release. To give meaning to each of those words, you have to give meaning to the wide component, but also to the theatrical component. And this is why I couldn't be a lawyer, because to parse language like this, I mean, this is how these lawsuits are settled. It comes down to one word. Is this plural? Does this have an S? It's crazy. Continuing on with what Daniel said, but again, I can't stress enough that all that matters is this key language in the contract. Whether Disney's stock price rose as a result of the simultaneous release does not matter. Whether Black Widow would have made more money if it had been exclusively released in theaters does not matter. All that matters is what this language means. One final note, it is super curious that Johansson is not suing Marvel in addition to Disney. Suing Disney makes sense. They have deep pockets, and she's alleging that they forced Marvel to breach Marvel's contract with her. But normally, when there's a breach of contract, the party suffering the breach sues the party that breached. Here, I'd imagine that Johansson is not suing Marvel because she has a good relationship with Marvel, and she thinks that Marvel's hands were truly tied, but that is purely speculation. That is a very interesting side note, because there have been reports, and again, these are unconfirmed reports. They're really rumors. When people say there have been reports, a lot of times that just means there's rumors. There have been rumors that Kevin Feige is not happy about this. There have been rumors that this has caused some contention inside the Disney-Marvel relationship because this decision was not something that was made at the Marvel level. This was a decision that was made at the Disney level. So perhaps that lends a little bit of credence to this, especially when we have a lawyer like Daniel who's saying, listen, I as a lawyer, it is unusual that Marvel's not included. It does seem that Scarlett Johansson's beef is with Disney here, and that she wants to keep Marvel proper out of it, at least in his opinion. And I agree with that. I think that's an interesting side note. So, again, this is one legal opinion. I'm not a lawyer, so of course I trust it because Daniel knows way more about legal issues than I do. But here we have one legal opinion saying, I think that this is a valid case. Perhaps this is going to go somewhere. Perhaps it'll be settled. That's probably the most likely outcome unless Disney really wants to play hardball. But I think the interesting thing that Daniel noted there is that this is going to set precedent either way because this is now going to be in every contract. And the back-end contract is something that really, when you go back to Jack Nicholson and Batman, 1989's Batman, structured a back-end contract that got him paid a massive amount of money. And you've seen more and more stars now go to that. Robert Downey Jr., another one, when you talk about an MCU actor, made tens of millions of dollars from structuring back-end contracts. With all of this streaming now, and with the distribution models changing, we may now see more and more stars asking for more money up front because these back-end contracts aren't lucrative, or asking for access to things like the streaming numbers because they need to know how much it makes on streaming because now that is part of the deal. So this is a huge thing, not just for Scarlett Johansson and Disney, but because this is largely going to set the stage for what contracts, what the legal side of these movies look like in the future. It adds potentially more money on the front end for movies to get made. It could drive budgets up. It could mean that you don't make certain movies at a certain budget point because you have to pay stars more up front. This is a very fascinating thing that is slowly unfolding. Obviously, things are going to escalate dramatically if more people file their own lawsuits or join in on this lawsuit. We will see what happens, but a very interesting story unfolding between one of Disney's biggest stars and Scarlett Johansson and in its biggest franchise in the MCU, and any divisions that causes, obviously, between Scarlett Johansson and Disney, between Disney and Marvel. Lots to be told, and we will continue to track this story here on the channel. One last time, though, I want to thank Daniel Strunk for his insight. Thank you for taking the time, Daniel, to weigh in on that and help me with this episode. So let's move on to the rest of the summer box office, the rest of the box office news for this weekend. As we've looked at the summer, as we mentioned that Jungle Cruise did outperform expectations. As we look at the summer weekend tracker, we see kind of more of the same, and that summer 2021 continues to track heavily behind 2018 and 2019, even though we did see declines in 2018 and 19 weekend to weekend. We saw an increase this past weekend in the 2021 box office, but we're still not running near the revenues that we were in the 13th weekend of the previous two summers where there were actually movies coming out. Now, perhaps we may see an uptick. It'll be interesting to see how the Suicide Squad does this weekend at theaters. However, this is also a hybrid release, so will that be keeping some people home? We've seen evidence suggesting both ways, so we just don't know, but we have the potential for a big box office weekend coming up. We'll have to see how that does. Looking at the top per theater average, Jungle Cruise was the highest earning movie on a theater by theater basis this past weekend, $8,125 at 4,310 theaters. And then when we move out of the realm of wide releases and look at limited release films, a lot of these have their holdovers. They've been on the charts for quite some time. Roadrunner, a film about Anthony Bourdain, remains the number one film in limited release. It shed about half of its theaters, but it is still at number one with $365,000. Pig is still at number two with another $240,000. Summer of Soul still drawing in people, $51,000 in 85 theaters. At number four, and I had to kind of reach out beyond, it wasn't listed on most charts that I saw, but this is a movie called 9 Days that opened in 4 theaters, drew in $18,455. This movie is slated for a wider release this upcoming weekend. It's got a great cast: Winston Dukes, Zazie Beetz, Benedict Wong, Tony Hale, Bill Skarsgård, a really strong cast. This movie actually debuted at the Sundance Film Festival a year and a half ago, January 2020, in the before times. It was acquired there. It's run through the awards circuit already. It was nominated for a couple of Independent Spirit Awards. It was nominated for Best First Feature. Benedict Wong was nominated for a Supporting Award. It's just now finding its way to theaters, so we may see an uptick in the performance of that movie next week. And then at number 5 is Queen Bees, a movie that's been on this chart off and on for a couple months now. In just 47 theaters, it brought in $15,000 in its 8th week of release. Looking outside the United States, let's look at the international box office chart. So this is every region in the world except for the domestic market, the United States and Canada. Raging Fire is the number 1 movie internationally with almost $35 million. This is a Hong Kong action film. It stars Donnie Yen. It's a police action thriller bringing in a lot of money, and we've been talking about the Chinese box office. We are still, and the talk is that this could extend into August, and we're seeing the fact that we still have major movies coming out. This period where China is focusing on domestic film production and the domestic film market, we're still seeing the results of that. No major Hollywood releases still coming out in China, and Raging Fire opening to $35 million. Jungle Cruise internationally, the second highest grossing film still, though, even without the Chinese market, with $27.6 million. Then a film that it's hard to really find good information about. I've seen it called Upcoming Summer. Perhaps now that it's made some money, I can find out a little bit more. I know that it is a romance, but it made $20.6 million at the Chinese box office. White Snake 2, Green Snake, the number 1 film from last week, is now number 4 with $10.7 million. And at number 5 is a real life, or a movie based on real life events from South Korea, Escape from Mogadishu. It's a movie that was delayed by the pandemic that's now coming out in theaters. And it did well enough in South Korea to take the number 5 spot on the international box office chart. So when we combine that market with the domestic market, we get the worldwide box office numbers for this past weekend. And when you add in its debut here in the United States and Canada, Jungle Cruise is the top earning movie worldwide with $62.6 million. Raging Fire and Upcoming are numbers 2 and 3. Then Old at $14.3 million. And still on the worldwide list because of its domestic gross is Black Widow with $14.1 million. Looking at the summer box office, the summer 2021 box office, F9 for right now is still the number 1 movie at the box office. I believe, actually, I thought this was going to happen like 2 or 3 weeks ago. I believe actually that Black Widow is going to overtake it to become the number 1 movie of the summer, although I thought that this was going to happen much, much quicker. But F9 is probably spending its last week at the top of the summer box office. Black Widow moves up 1 spot to number 2. A Quiet Place Part 2 drops 1 spot to number 3. And then 4 through 7 remain the same, although we are going to be seeing Jungle Cruise on this chart very soon. It's just outside the top 10, so it's going to be knocking off The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard here in the next day or two to become the 10th highest grossing film of summer 2021. And when you look at my top 10 predictions, I have Black Widow was my number 1 prediction. It should be in that spot next week. The Suicide Squad will be releasing this week. Of course, Shang-Chi we're not going to know until the first weekend in September. F9 is on the list. In the Heights, still eliminated. A Quiet Place Part 2 is going to be on the list comfortably. Free Guy has not been released. Jungle Cruise next week will be in the top 10. So that's another movie that I predicted. It came in actually to replace Hotel Transylvania 4. I think last week I said Hotel Transylvania 3. It's Hotel Transylvania 4 that got bumped off the summer list. And then The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, looks like it's going to comfortably be on the list. And then Candyman, we'll see how it does. So I think it's not going to be a great summer for me, but I still have several movies that are still there, still in contention, and we'll see how many I'm actually able to predict in that summer top 10. Looking at the 2021 domestic box office charts, again, this is pretty much heavily tied to the summer because most of these are summer movies. F9 remains number 1. Black Widow moves up 1 to number 2. A Quiet Place Part 2 moves down to number 3. Then we have Godzilla vs. Kong, still one of only 4 movies to break that $100 million mark. Are we going to get a 5th in the next few weeks? Cruella is at number 5. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It at 6. Space Jam: A New Legacy moves up 1 spot to number 7. Raya and the Last Dragon moves down 1 spot to number 8.
And then we rounded out with The Boss Baby, Family Business, and Demon Slayer the movie. Again, I believe Demon Slayer is probably going to be supplanted. Honestly, by next week, it could be, depending on the size of the release, supplanted by both Jungle Cruise and The Suicide Squad. If The Suicide Squad has a big opening, we're talking a Black Widow-sized opening at the box office, we could see a couple of movies drop off this chart, so we're just going to have to see how that does. And then looking at the 2021 worldwide box office, not much changes. We still have Hi Mom and Detective Chinatown 3. F9 still trying to sneak up there and take that number 2 slot. We'll see if they're able to do that. Black Widow stays at number 5. It's there at $343 million, and China is really going to determine how this movie does. If it does not do well in China, we're going to be looking at a really, as far as Marvel goes, I mean, I'm talking a phase 1 level global gross for Black Widow. And, you know, keeping in mind there was a healthy amount of money made on Disney Plus with Premier Access, but still in the record books for the box office, it is going to be a low global gross for Black Widow. And the question is going to be, did they give up more at the box office than they have made with this streaming access? We just don't know. A Quiet Place Part 2 at 6, Cruella 7, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It at 8. Chinese Doctors moves up 1 from number 10 to number 9, and that bumps another Chinese film, Cliff Walker's, down to number 10 from number 9. And as we look at the top 10 highest grossers over the previous 365 days, F9 is at number 1, Black Widow is at number 2. It will soon take over that spot. A Quiet Place Part 3 moves down to number 3. A Space Jam: A New Legacy moves up to number 7. That drops down both The Croods: A New Age and Tenet to numbers 8 and 9. Raya and the Last Dragon drops down to number 10. And this, again, is a huge question. I don't think it's going to make it, even though if you look at Tenet, 334 days in release, which means it is literally one long calendar month away from being on the box office charts for a full 365 days, being the first movie since we started tracking this to actually achieve that landmark. I don't see it happening. I just don't think we're going to get through another month without two movies crossing that $57.9 million threshold. Maybe a miracle will happen and Tenet's going to be able to hang on, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to get very close, but I think we're going to go a very long time before we see a movie actually stay on this chart for 365 full days, because I also don't think The Croods: A New Age is going to make it either. So this is going to be a very less interesting chart once Tenet and The Croods: A New Age are off of it, but we will continue to track everything as it moves on the chart. Still, though, Tenet's, we're down to like one finger. They're hanging onto this list by their pinky, and I think you're going to come close, but I don't quite think it's going to make it. So before we look at the streaming charts, let's do a little flashback to a box office weekend past, and we're actually going to go back to the year of my birth. We're going to go back to the box office weekend in 1983, just because it's an interesting way of looking at the longevity of films and how they used to hang around. We had National Lampoon's Vacation in its second week at number 1 on the weekend of August 5th through the 7th in 1983. Return of the Jedi in its 11th week was still number 2 at the box office. That movie played all summer long. At number 3, A Star is Born. Risky Business, starring Tom Cruise, in its first week made $4.2 million. It launched Tom Cruise. Top Gun also was a big thing, but Tom Cruise, I think, became a household name for a lot of people after the release of Risky Business. At number 4, in its third week of release, Jaws 3D, one of the cheesiest movies ever made that would then be out-cheesed by its sequel, Jaws the Revenge. Although I will have to say, The Third Dimension is Terror is a great tagline for a movie, and the Jaws sequels, as not great as they may have been, had really good taglines. Jaws 2's tagline was, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. Great tagline. The Third Dimension is Terror. That's a great tagline for a 3D movie. And then, of course, Jaws the Revenge's tagline, this time it's personal. The Jaws sequel's taglines were as good as the movies were disappointing. And then when we look at Staying Alive, in its fourth week, the sequel to Saturday Night Fever starring John Travolta with $3.6 billion. That movie, of course, directed by Sylvester Stallone. One of the movies he directed that he did not have a major role in. Let's wrap up the show as we always do by looking at the streaming charts, and we're going to start with Amazon. At number 1 is F9. F9 is now available as a premium video on demand release. That tops the charts over on Amazon, followed by The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard. The rental window is now open on A Quiet Place Part 2, so people can now rent the film. That's why you're seeing an uptick there. It's at number 3. The Forever Purge and Wrath of Man stay on at numbers 4 and 5. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. The 4K premium video on demand at number 6. Nobody is at number 7. And man, was it great news to hear that Bob Odenkirk is on the mend, and it sounds like he's going to be okay. That was a scary few days, and as a fan of his and of Better Call Saul and of this movie, by the way, Nobody, it was very happy to hear that he's going to come out of the other end of this heart attack and hopefully as strong or stronger as he was. Spiral from the Book of Saw at number 8, the HD rental of A Quiet Place Part 2 at number 9, and then the HD premium video on demand of The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It at number 10. So the horror genre taking up, just with 2 movies, 4 spots there on the top 10 for Amazon. Let's see what people are watching through iTunes and their Apple devices. At number 1, the premium video on demand version of F9. At number 2, A Quiet Place Part 2, boosted again by opening the rental window. Wrath of Man is at number 3, The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard at number 4. At number 5 is a new movie called Ride the Eagle, which is co-written by and also starring Jake Johnson, also has J.K. Simmons and Susan Sarandon, so that opens up its on-demand availability at number 5. Nobody is at number 6. The Courier returns to the chart at number 7. Peter Rabbit 2, The Purchase Window, at number 8. The Paper Tigers is a movie that's at number 9. And again, this 99-cent rental strategy really does seem to work for a lot of these movies because, you're giving up some of the revenue, but there you are in the top 10. This was a movie that was released, I think, earlier this year, a kung fu comedy that is just, I think, because it was cheap to rent, goes up to number 10 on the iTunes charts. And then at number 7, the premium video on demand of The Forever Purge. And of course, we wrap up by looking at Netflix and what people are watching on that streaming service. First of all, looking at the overall chart, we have Outer Banks, which is a Netflix original series, season 2 of this series, at number 1. All American, which is a series on the CW that has new episodes available, is at number 2. Resort to Love, which is a new Netflix movie, at number 3. Love is Blind After the Altar, a spinoff of the Netflix reality show Love is Blind, is at number 4. At number 5 is The Vault, which is a movie that we saw on the streaming chart just a week or 2 ago. It's now available for people to stream on Netflix. Virgin River is at number 6. Because the sun gods have demanded it, and apparently the sacrifice has been made, Coco Melon stays on the chart at number 7. New episodes of The Flash available at number 8, so people catching up on the newest available season of The Flash. Manifest remains on the chart at number 9, and then the Netflix original movie Blood Red Sky is at number 10. And finally, just wrapping up with the movies that people are watching on Netflix. Some of the Twilight films have been falling from grace, so we've seen a return of a lot of titles that have been on the chart previously. Resort to Love, the Netflix original movie, is at number 1. The Vault is at number 2. Blood Red Sky is at number 3. The Last Mercenary, which is a Netflix original film starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, is at number 4. Fear Street Part 1, 1994, returns to the chart. People may be catching up on that series. Mara and I certainly did just recently. Those are pretty good movies. I enjoyed them. That's at number 5. Rurouni Kenshin, The Beginning. This is a movie that we saw on the chart earlier this year. It comes back at number 6. The Last Letter from Your Lover, a Netflix original, at number 7. Twilight, the first movie, remains on the chart at number 8. At number 9, the animated film Home. And at number 10, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2. So the beginning and ending entries of the Twilight films remain on the Netflix top 10 movie list. And that wraps up the show for this week. Next week, we're going to have a lot to cover. We have the release of The Suicide Squad, a highly anticipated film. Early buzz is very positive on that movie. Stay tuned this week here on the channel because I'm not only going to have a review for The Suicide Squad probably on Tuesday night or Wednesday. I'm not quite sure when. It could potentially get pushed to Thursday. But while I'm here in LA, I think I'm going to have an opportunity to see the movie, so stay tuned for that. Also, stay tuned for a review of Free Guy. I am definitely going to have a chance to catch a screening of Free Guy while I'm in town, so look for a review of that movie this week on the channel as well. But next week, we're going to talk about the opening of Suicide Squad and how it impacted the box office. If there are any more developments in the Scarlett Johansson case, lots of things still to talk about as we enter the last official month of the summer movie season. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And you can always check out the channel here, of course, at youtube.com/Dan Murrell Movies for news, reviews, you name it. All my movies is on a little bit of a hiatus, but it will be back soon. So much fun doing stuff and finding new stuff and traveling around and talking box office and all kinds of great stuff. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Thanks for bearing with me as I call in from the road, and we'll be back in the studio next Monday. Bye.